morning.
We're going to get started here in just a moment. As people are coming in, feel free to grab a cup of coffee or two, maybe three. I don't know. I only got about four swallows in this morning, and so I'm feeling a little low on caffeine. But we are really privileged today to have Adam Copeland here from Luther Seminary. He's let me get this right, the director of the Center for Stewardship Leadership at Luther Seminary. He is an ordained Presbyterian and has served in congregations, ministries in the Fargo area. Is that fair to say? And is working on a PhD at NDSU. Not quite done? Okay. And he's also happens to be married to one of my classmates from seminary, Megan, who just left because she's probably heard this presentation before. So, Adam brings extensive leadership and stewardship and in thinking about church in the 21st century. And so we're really grateful to have him here. And so let's welcome him.
Thanks so much. It's great to be with you all this morning. As Jason was saying, my wife actually is next, like summer 2017, will be beginning a job at Mayo. You may have heard of it, and so we'll be coming. Is it Rochesterians, Rochesterites? I don't know what it is. We'll be moving to Rochester the next 12 to 14 months, so it's particularly good to be with you all this morning. So it's, this will be our new community. So this morning I'm going to sort of talk some about what stewardship is, we're going to set some foundations, and then think about where we might be going as a church and as a culture with stewardship in mind, but also with some other cultural moves in mind. So we've already done the introduction stuff. I think if there's anything else, I guess I'll say so I've been at Luther Seminary just for about a year. Previously, I served as a rural pastor and as a new church developer in Fargo. So I've got some sort of different varieties of experience. So the presentation this morning, we're going to talk about where we are now in terms of sort of stewardship culture, and we're going to define what is stewardship after all, what's this word I'm already using, and what are some of the preconceptions, and then where might we be going. So where are we now? Let's begin with that. So here's, I'll break this down a little bit, but if you can't see the details, that's okay. Just sort of, so where are we now in terms of religious giving? I'm going to start financial. A lot of this is going to be financial stewardship, although stewardship is more broad. It's a little fuzzy, but this is giving by denomination by percent of, I always get all the details wrong a little bit. Total religious and non-religious giving by percent of household income. So the bottom of the bar, so we'll go with Lutherans. The bottom of the bar here, the sort of the white part, is the percent of sort of religious giving to nonprofits or sort of faith-related organizations that sort of beyond the church, but that are faith-related, and then the other part's church. The basic point here is Lutherans, on average, as a percent of disposable income, give about 1.7% to faith-related charities, including the church. And that's so Presbyterians 1.8, Episcopalians are 2.0, the outliers here are Mormons, 5.2. So that's sort of, that's part of their denomination. And then this is just a graph of religious giving over the years. So this is 2.0, and you can see goes up and down a little bit. This was during the recession. The most recent one, it went down to 1.8, but now it's back up in 2014 to 2. But basically, as a general rule, for the last long while, religious giving rates have been around 2% of disposable income, and that's pretty consistent across the board. So so generally, just as we're thinking about churches, usually that's somewhat I don't know if shocking is the right word, but maybe let's just say there's room for improvement for many of us, and it's both comforting and problematic to appreciate that is often true, and that there's not that much denominational difference, right? So between Lutherans and Presbyterians and Episcopals, we're all pretty close to the same area of giving. I guess that's good, that there's not these huge outliers, but it's also, I think, gives us a space to welcome some sort of particular focus from a denominational point of view. So here's the other interesting just sort of statistic as we think about setting the foundation. This is a graph of, the details don't matter really, I just want you to look at the line. This is the graph of registered 501c3 public charities that are religion related. So since 1995 to 2010. So basically you can see all the new nonprofits that are being created. That's delightful. It's wonderful that Americans create these nonprofits that have these charitable ends, and then sort of ask for gifts from all of us. That's fantastic. And from a congregational point of view, this is the sort of the religious giving landscape is one in which the nonprofits are proliferating, and churches are having to claim our space in the religious giving world. And nonprofits are becoming more sophisticated and more careful about their invitations to giving. So as we continue just to set the foundation here, here's a sort of general rule that tends to be true in most congregations. Most congregations, around 80% of the financial giving comes from 20% of the members. So that's across the board, that's generally true. And then it's often a pastor friend will see this and say, well, I think it's more like 90-10 in my congregation. That they, if they look at the records, that sort of a lot of the budget is provided by if you think about it, not those who give 10%, but those who give 2%, but those who give 10 or 15% of disposable income. And if because of that disparity, the percent of the congregational budget is pretty significantly supported by those folks. All right, so that's just a little bit of throwing some numbers at you that maybe sort of shocking or surprising, and that's very intentional. Right? I just wanted to throw it out there. We don't tend to talk about money in public, especially in the church. So I'm going to try to do some countercultural things today. And so to get that, to keep that foundation going, I want you to just turn to somebody near you and for 2 minutes talk about what's one of your earliest memories around money and finances. What's one of your earliest memories around money and finances? Just 2 minutes.
That goes way back, doesn't it?
I remember Bob and I being involved in a lot of development stuff at Holy Cross. Remember when we hired Holy Cross, hired a development firm to come in and give us a plan, and we had to pay them $25,000 for this plan, and we got nothing. Martin Younger was on in the show.
That's really tragic, but there are a lot of you gotta watch it. So you guys come out of the Missouri Synod too, huh? Yeah, escapees. I was Missouri Synod all my life.
Wanderers. Well, we had to put those windows in. Those were $100 per pane back in.
Yeah.
That is Holy Cross?
Yeah, a row of. They're about the half the size of the door. And the roof is leaking forever.
About 30 more seconds or so.
I'm amazed at this roof that we've got here at this church. So the architect really was creative, wasn't he?
Interesting perspective.
Yes. Well, I think maybe money-wise, you know, my thoughts were at the first job, you know, when I was a teenager. You know, you start planning, what are you going to do with this? How much are you going to make?
Where I lived, young teenager.
All right.
The pastor was a full-time painter.
Come on back here. So I'm curious, are any particular sort of surprising stories that either you or someone in your group shared? Any thoughts that would be helpful for us all on? Yeah.
I just shared that with my dad. Our congregation at the end of the year would publish a little booklet that would tell how much a family had given.
Great, yeah.
And on Sunday morning, I observed my dad taking money out of his bill drawer and putting it in. I said, Dad, how do they do that? How do they know how much you put in so they can total it? And his answer was that in business on Main Street, you were expected to kind of be at a certain level, and if you gave beyond that, it looked not too good. So that was a different angle.
Yeah, great, yeah. So thanks for speaking out. I think most folks heard you. You know, sharing that congregations would actually publish how much each family gave in a sort of annual report type thing, and that was common in many traditions for a time. In fact, along the way, sort of historically, some congregations actually sort of would flip it around and say to their members, "This is what we expect you to give." And then a pastor, there's a story of, I think it was in the 1920s, a pastor would walk around always with this a ledger in his pocket. And it's because when he would be making pastoral calls, folks would give him the family's contributions, and he would immediately write it down. And if you think about it, the families were like, we want the pastor to know that we're giving, so we're going to give the money straight to him. You know, times have changed. Hopefully, and that's, you know, and there's pluses and minuses for all these stories and shifts. How about one more story or response thing?
I had in our congregational church as I was growing up, we read from the Bible about tithing, but no one ever talked about tithing. I did not know what tithing meant, except that it was something good to do. Yeah,
that's great. Yeah, you know, which brings up, there's in the church, because we don't tend to talk about money and giving generally. When we do, we often don't do it in a way that actually sort of explains what we mean or invites people into sort of a full understanding. So that's a great example of one of those sort of tensions. Well, I won't get started tithing, but yeah. So that's the so we can see, like, I think those early memories of and our early experiences of sort of how we talked about money with our families or with our friends or with our congregations shape some of our approaches to money now. But we tend not to think about sort of how they're connected. But as we know, sort of all the early sort of cultural experiences affected sort of where we are now. So I've been talking about this word stewardship, and so I'm going to try not to just talk about this word without defining it, without giving some foundation here. So let me do that. So stewardship, what is this stewardship thing? So this is just, so I did a search on Google Books, has this huge corpus of like all the books that have been digitized in the world, and so you can search for different words. And so the blue is stewardship. So how often it appears in Google Books, and green is fundraising. So see, from 1960 or 70 or so, stewardship and fundraising language has been part of our culture, part of our publications more often, versus tithing, which already came up earlier. It has gone down and is just sort of compared to the other words as just pretty flat. And so I did the same search with adding stewardship plus money. And there's, in the 1920s and 30s, there's this big boom in stewardship. Denominations thought that this was going to sort of save the church, and they had the big mission push. So it went up there, but then it's been going down and pretty flat. This is stewardship with the word environment. So if you search the stewardship and environment related, that's gone up, you can see, just pretty significantly. And so stewardship is a word, that's to say that in the culture, Stewardship is a word that's being used more and more often, but tends to be around issues of environmental stewardship, issue of care for the world. And for Christians, that's fine. It's the same type of approach. It's using the same sort of basic metaphor. But it's interesting for us then to think about how this word's being used beyond the church setting. Stewardship comes from an old Old English word that that's from it's a word called stigward. It's sort of stig used to be a house, and then ward is one who cares for a house. So sort of back in the day, a steward is one who manages the affairs of a household. So if you're fans of Downton Abbey, I think of Carson, Mr. Carson as sort of the chief steward, And actually, Downton Abbey, sometimes they use the word stewards for those who are caring for the land, sort of beyond the abbey, and that's accurate in terms of the historic use of the word. So it's one who manages the affairs for somebody else. So a steward doesn't actually own the house or doesn't actually own the land, but is managing it on behalf of somebody else. And so if we think about Christian usage, that's the same type of approach continues, that we're managing all the gifts of God on behalf of God, not because we own them ourselves. And that's some of the connections to the earth language. So this is from Douglas John Hall's book, The Steward. He says, the steward is a particularly apt metaphor for humanity because it encapsulates the two sides of human relatedness, the relation of God on the one hand and the non-human creatures on the other. The human being is, as God's steward, accountable to God and responsible to its fellow creatures. So again, that's sort of saying, so we're stewards of God's gifts, of God's creation, of the gift of that money is for our culture and how we live together. We can talk about the Bible forever, so I'm just going to give a few biblical foundations here, but I'm highlighting that this is just as thin as I feel comfortable doing, but here it is. So so in Genesis, in the first creation story, the second half of the sixth day of creation, God said, God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it." This is to the human creatures, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. So God's first words after creating humankind was about our relationship to the earth. So dominion then should be understood in light of being created in God's image. Like God exercises dominion in a way of deep love and sacrificial care, humankind is created to do the same. So Walter Brueggemann, the distinguished Old Testament scholar, he suggests that dominion is that, this is good. Is it a Good Shepherd Sunday here? Or no, okay, never mind. It's okay, in some places it is, that's fine. So that dominion is that, this is Brueggemann, is that of a shepherd. So how do you understand that word dominion? Brueggemann says, it's that of a shepherd who cares for, tends, and feeds the animals. Thus, the task of dominion does not have to do with exploitation or abuse. It has instead to do with securing the well-being of every other creature and bringing the promise of each to its full fruition. Recently, I came across this beautiful question about how do we think about stewardship, how do we think about money in terms of Jesus' relation to it. And this is from Lance Pappy, he teaches at Bright Divinity School. He says, so too often we look at the Bible as just some sort of magical answer book that is just, we take our contemporary question and all our contemporary experiences and we just read a passage as if that's going to speak exactly into our contemporary experience. And Pappy says, no. What we should think about is, the Gospels especially are stories of this man God Jesus, and that that what we should do then is to read those stories as stories about the foundation of the person Jesus, and then we should ask not to Jesus as sort of this magical answer book, or sort of ask him a question and he'll respond as if in jeopardy, but to take instead this question: what would it mean to think about and talk about X? So in this case, maybe money, stewardship, possessions, in the presence of Jesus. What would it mean to think about money in the presence of Jesus? And if you think about the stories we know about Jesus, that's a lot of what Jesus does, is he invites people into a conversation and tells stories about their relationship with money. Do any stories of Jesus and money come to mind? There's a lot of them. Jesus talked about money more than everything but the kingdom of God. He talked about money a whole lot. I'm just curious, any the lost coin, great, yep, great. Give under Caesar. Yeah, so I'm trying to figure out like how does money function in culture? Great. Money changers in the temple. Yep, so they're critiquing how money is being used in society again, yeah.
The widow's mite.
The widow's mite, great. So right after the money, the temple, he goes and talks about this woman who gives to sort of her last 2 coins. Great.
Camels and needles.
Yeah. So there's a lot of stories about wealth and what in the world can rich the rich young ruler. What does Jesus tend to say to those who have wealth? And he tends to give responses that completely freak them out, right? So he says, to go and sell your possessions and give the money to the poor. Or I love the story of Zacchaeus, which he doesn't talk about money with Zacchaeus, but you remember what Zacchaeus does after he has this experience of meeting Jesus? Yeah. So he has this experience of repaying through how the taxpayers that he's swindled, and then so there's something about being in a relationship with Jesus that changes people's perspective on money. But he doesn't talk about it in a way, this is obvious, but in a way of sort of giving us investment advice or sort of predicting exactly what's going to happen to the market or anything like that. Instead, I think from a New Testament point of view, we can think about, well, what would it mean to talk about money in relationship in the presence of Jesus, and sort of how do we bring all our concerns around money to Jesus? And usually it's about relationship. Usually it's about our relationship between God and money, or God and wealth. And so there's a great passage where he talks about where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And so it's thinking about sort of our heart follows our values, sort of what we treasure in our lives. And so it's all, again, that's all about relationships. So we could go on this for all day, but I want to keep moving on so we can sort of get the stewardship foundation here. So this is from Grace Study Pomeroy. Stewardship, she says, she has a very holistic definition, is the way we use the abundance that God has entrusted to our care to love God and neighbor. So this is a sort of well beyond money to talk about all of God's generosity and abundance. Ralph Jacobson, who teaches at the seminary, he says, this is sort of very orthodox, but it's also just delightfully put. He says, because we belong to God, everything about us belongs to God. Ourselves, our bodies, our families, our time, our relationship, even our possessions. So this is my attempt to say, so what does a stewardship claim to look like? I said practicing stewardship today results in sharing that surprises, think about those New Testament stories, compassion that complicates. I think stewardship is incredibly complex and annoying, and it's complicating. I love that inspires. There's something about Jesus' experience with folks that is inspiring and sort of pushes folks to a new way of relating to one another. All right, here's another question for your partner or two around so I think that, so the question is, who do you know that's a generous steward of their gifts, and how do they live generously? I'm asking this question because I think when we think about stewardship, it's easy to get stuck in these intellectual ideas and to get stuck on those sort of giving number slides. But actually, I think stewardship and generosity is something that we can recognize pretty easily in one another. And it's one of those things we know when we see it. And I think then, once we identify it, we can seek to respond and do likewise. So who do you know that's a generous steward of their gifts? And gifts can be gifts of any kind. And how do they live generously? So 2 minutes to talk to somebody around you.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate it.
You're counting us.
And he full of friendship. As needs came known, he would help furnish people's apartments. Like people who were, you know, there was no program, there was no he would be proud. He started things like help settle some bankruptcies. In like the early 90s, and I think that was connected to people needed some more help. Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And so it started there, and then just started, you know, building relationships, and then, you know, some more of their family would come and sort of help them out. And then pretty soon people knew about Joe, and Joe, you know, oh, you know, he's got those resources. And then he built
About 30 seconds.
Apartments, little short guy, 5 foot, It's trying to get bonuses, you know, other people's money. So, you know, I had this fund for 3 years, but now, you know, I turn my, you know, now living rooms, buying furniture, all this kitchen covers. It's got another 10 years left, you know, so something.
Great. So what type of areas of conversation did you all develop? And I think there's an extra mic I can walk.
I have a question.
Great, okay.
You know that you showed at the beginning a 2%, and that 2%, okay, we're supposed...
Can you use the mic? So people can hear you?
Can't you hear me?
No.
Okay.
Great.
Okay, we're supposed to give 10%, that's kind of general.
Okay.
Okay, now the 2% that you showed at the beginning, is that's only the religious giving, or is that giving to all the charities that we have?
Yeah, so the question, yeah, so these stats are really hard to get, so I'm going to start there. The 2% of was towards religious giving, so organizations that are connected to religion in sort of in any number of ways. So that would include things like a church-related college, or Habitat for Humanity, or things like that, but not probably Mayo Clinic or a 501c3 nonprofit that doesn't have any connection. And thanks for bringing up tithing. I'm going to get at tithing a little bit sort of along the way, but that's so it's one of these things, and that sort of I think our expectations and assumptions around giving and sort of giving by percentage, giving whatever, are things that we seldom talk about in congregational life together, and so it's wonderful to have a time to be able to sort of get at that. So yeah, thanks for the question.
Well, tithing and stewardship, I've always kind of put it in an apple, one apple.
Sure. Yeah. So here's my question around tithing and stewardship, without getting to the sort of all the interesting Bible questions. So if that's true, that giving rates are around 2%, if you're sort of a young family that's not even at that point, so as an average, does talking about giving 10% to, even if we're going to say 10% to any charity, not just the church, is that sort of a hospitable, welcoming challenge, or is it something that completely freaks them out and is so much higher than what they're already giving, sort of stops the conversation before it even starts? And so it's a question. It's a question that the church is wrestling with, because sort of we've tended to preach tithing without preaching tithing. So it's this assumption, but we never actually acknowledge that sort of those stats are what they are. And then when we do, it can become a shaming experience rather than an invitational experience. So I'm going to get at that in a different sort of way in a second.
A question here?
Yeah, great.
Mr. Hogan told me to bring this up about my father. So I'm from a farming family in Iowa, and we had a wonderful farm that my folks worked really, really hard to get a down payment on. But as soon as my dad got established, he made sure that he took care of the land properly. And our farm was one of the first ones that used the terrace farming. And I think in our beautiful springtime here, we can't help but think about God's creation and how we really are stewards of that. And how do you measure that? You can't say 10%. You can't say 2%. You have to give 100% in some things.
Thank you. That's beautifully put. And remember, what was God in the garden but a gardener? And so that's sort of absolutely stewardship of creation is at the heart of all of what we're doing, and that's and sort of a lot of this for farmers, like, yeah, obviously this is what we do every day, So how about one more example of generosity, or let's go up here. The microphone's coming.
I think that it's an interpretation of gifts, and I know that the church does not survive or provide their services based on other people's being kind or working hard or giving or helping their neighbors with their chores. But I think that a person like many of you know Trent Flugel, who is a brilliant executive director of Interfaith Hospitality Network here in Rochester, and prior to that was at Habitat for Humanity, could make a great deal of money. He could have a nice house. He could have all those things. But he, as we said here, he can't help it. He serves the poor, and that's what he does.
That's a great example. Yeah. So it reminds me. So in stewardship world in the 90s, particularly, there is this language around stewardship of the T's. So time, talent, treasure. So and sort of, especially folks in the church, once we get a list going, you don't want to stop. So now, I've also heard stewardship of testimony. So telling stories like that, and telling stories in our congregation about gifts being shared. What are some other ones I've heard recently? Tissue, so bodies, and how do we steward our bodies, and how do we, or an organ donation, or just sort of our life together. Nicely done. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's good. That's good. The treats. Yeah, that's perfect. So I'm sure, and as I walked around, I heard lots of great stories of folks who have been generous stewards with their gifts, and sort of all of those different T's or whatever the words start with. So now I'm going to move to thinking about where we might be going. So this is, and the tithing question is a great setup for this. Where might we be going? So this is some paradigms of religious giving, initially developed by the Lake Institute of Faith and Giving out of Indiana University, Lilly's School of Philanthropy, and the sort of idea is that there's this older paradigm of giving, and there's an emerging or newer paradigm of religious giving. We can think about these as cultural shifts, and I'm going to give you the secret already. So rather than waiting for the end, here's the secret. In most congregations, both of these are true. And so we're communities where we've got an older paradigm of giving and a newer paradigm of giving living together in Christian community. And it's a great gift. It's also a great challenge to figure out how we talk about this. So I'm going to run through a few of these. So an older paradigm of giving, let me also say, and there's not judgment connected with these either. That these are sort of culturally, this is just sort of how our ways of developing and talking about money and gifts has sort of has become the water we swim in. And so in the older paradigm of giving is done out of religious obligation. It's just for what we do. I'm a member of a church, I give to a church, versus giving out of personal choice. And so I think Pastor Jason deals with new member classes. This would be an interesting conversation to have with them as they decide to become new members. If they haven't been in a congregation in a long time, or if they haven't been in a congregation at all, they probably have no idea about expectations around giving. Because how would they? And so how do we talk to them? Do we say, our expectation is that you give 10%? Or do we say, we know there's many places where you can to give generously in your lives, and here's why we think you should, it would be wise for you to give to the church because of all the amazing things God is doing here. And we invite you to join us in supporting that ministry here. And your membership and your connection to the congregation will become stronger because you're putting your treasure there. So it's about how do we get at that. So giving to support the common good is an older paradigm versus giving to make a new idea or possibility come into being. I think this is behind a lot of those, remember that nonprofit slide, how many nonprofits are being created? There's something, and I think it's particularly American, about us, like we find a problem, or we have an idea, and we want to solve it. That's delightful. And so we create a new nonprofit to help to bring this new idea into being. That's fantastic. It's also challenging in terms of the whole sort of religious giving sphere, rather than giving to support the common good. So this would be the old United Way model, giving to a sort of one community-wide nonprofit that then makes careful decisions about how to spread that money around versus giving to particular nonprofits because of individual relationships you've established. So similarly, sort of giving to an ELCA church because, gosh darn it, I'm Lutheran and that's what I'm supposed to do, versus giving to a particular congregation because of a relationship I've developed there. So older paradigm giving, institutions are autonomous, they function on their own, and they make their choices about how to use the money resources given to them, versus an emerging paradigm in which donors are collaborative partners. So that if the members in the organization help develop the mission and the vision of that organization. So it's a partnership model that emphasizes relationality rather than sort of a top-down decision-making point. This is one I made up, but I love it. So Americans have a tendency not to discuss giving habits. That's sort of from Robert Withnow's research. Versus sharing giving habits are not just enabled, but expected. So for me, I study new media, internet stuff a lot. And so if I give to Minnesota Public Radio, at the end of my giving, so I go to a website, I put an amount, and at the end of it, this thing pops up and it says, thank you so much for your gift. Share on Facebook and on Twitter and that you supported us. And this sort of, I just have to click once and it immediately appears on my page. And other folks then, see that I gave money, like that's, I'm sharing my giving choices publicly, and they're also invited to give because of, sort of the invitation that's part of that message. That's very different than an older paradigm that might say, my giving's between me and God, and I don't talk about it publicly. So moving a few more, so the older paradigm, institutions are to be trusted, versus institutional trust must be earned. And so rather than saying, I give to this nonprofit because of its fantastic history and a brand, rather than, you have to make an argument to me about why I should give to your organization and how are you using those funds wisely. And so before I'm going to give. Giving is contribution or donation versus giving is creating change. So it's sort of how do we think about giving? Theology of duty versus theology of grace. budgets are need-driven versus budgets are mission and values-driven. So, and you can think about sort of the congregational culture here around your budgeting process and how do you talk about that collectively. And then finally, the financial focus is insular versus a more outward or global financial focus. So I think to sum up then, we're moving from an area in which religious giving was assumed to an area in which motivations matter, stories help secure gifts, showing gratitude becomes essential. So if giving is about a relationship and earning trust, then especially in congregational life, it's so important to, so think about those new members that Jason's working with. If they haven't given to a church before and they give for the first time, and if we don't thank them in that process, and every other nonprofit they're giving to thanks them 3 times that year, what are we saying as a congregation? So we're not establishing the same sort of relationship that's in the broader sector around giving. And again, like, I don't think there's judgment there. I think it's just a different way of thinking about how we're developing that relationship. I interrupted myself. And then an invitation to a shared, inspired vision matters deeply. So I'm gonna end, how am I gonna do this? Okay, we're gonna do a short little bit on electronic giving, and then gonna end with thinking about crowdfunding as a new possibility for congregational giving. So we're gonna skip that, but so this is the Vanco, which is a automatic, it's a big payment processing company that partners with the ELCA. They just did this big study on electronic giving and sort of how it's being used by congregations, how it might be used better. And I'm just going to share 2 big findings on the study. One, they found what they called a giving gap, which they were able to show that there's basically, sort of, this is not just about this congregation, so don't get me wrong, this is about sort of the whole mainline denominations, that there's a gap between how folks would like to give versus how congregations provide giving options. And so there's this gap between how people in every age group, interestingly, would prefer to give electronically or have some sort of automatic payment option, and congregations across the board, on average, aren't offering that as much as folks would like. And this blew my mind a little bit. Churchgoers who are most engaged with churches also have stronger preference toward electronic giving. This blew my mind because it's not how we tend to talk about electronic giving in the church. So we tend to talk about electronic giving in the church as a way to bring in those marginal members that don't give regularly and sort of say, well, maybe we can trick them into signing on this form to give through an automatic payment from their bank account or on their credit card. Then they'll suddenly become these regular givers. Well, the study found, and this makes perfect sense if we think about it, that actually it's those folks who are already committed members, who already give regularly, who prefer electronic giving options. So my wife, Megan, and I give to a variety of charities and nonprofits, all online. The only time I write a check is to my landlord, which is really annoying that she doesn't accept electronic payments. And then I wrote some checks last week to the federal government for taxes. So I haven't carried cash in my wallet for 5 weeks. So I'm in a world in which electronic payments is just sort of the normal thing. So the Vanco study found that it's those most committed members who give electronically and have electronic financial experiences everywhere in their lives that are looking for that in congregations. And we should then think about those as our already core members and being hospitable to those folks to give electronic giving options, not just through this magical way to bring in folks on the margins. All right, so I'm going to end with 5 minutes on crowdfunding. I'm writing a dissertation on crowdfunding, so this is going to be really hard for me, but here we go. Okay. So how many have heard of crowdfunding? What is this crowdfunding thing? Okay, a handful. So I'm going to give you the scientific definition, and then we're going to break it down. So Ethan Mollick says it's the practice of funding a project or venture by raising many small amounts of money from a large number of people, typically via the internet. So this usually plays brilliant. So let's say I'm a person, I've got an idea, I want to create this new thing to exist in the world. But I don't have enough money to help bring that idea into being. And so I put this idea on the internet and say, hey, world, do you think this idea is a good idea? If so, give me some money to help support it. And as a response, I'm going to give you perks or rewards. So maybe, the old NPR trick is a tote bag or, whatever, water bottle. They're going to brand it with my idea, and you're going to feel part of this communal experience. The two biggest sites that are functioning in the crowdfunding world at the moment are Indiegogo and Kickstarter. And there's also WeRaise, GoFundMe, CrowdRise, there's Generosity.com. There's all this huge proliferation of sites about inviting folks to give electronically to these new visions. So has anyone supported a crowdfunding campaign here? Yeah, so what? I'm curious. Just
yeah, Kickstarter.
Kickstarter? Great. Do you remember what it was for? Children's theater. Great. Great. Jason?
I have a friend who's starting a bread delivery bakery in St. Paul, and known him a long time, and so supported him in that venture.
Great. So it's a business venture, but it has sort of the social good as part of it. Yeah, great. And a lot of that's sort of a common theme. There was one other over here. Oh yeah, in the back.
How do you know that those are legitimate things?
Yeah, how do you know it's legitimate things? That's great. Yeah. Yeah. So let's look at a few of the examples here. And so I'm going to highlight some religion-related examples. But they're certainly they're more than that. So this is an example. It's a congregation, and it's not a church card anymore in St. Paul. It's called Humble Walk Community Church. And they invited this, they got a grant to support some local artists to come in and sort of be guest musicians with them for a year. And at the end of that, they realized they had this year worth of new songs and that they wanted to share with the world. But they didn't have enough money to create a CD or anything like that. So they ended up doing a campaign to record a CD and then send that CD out to the church. And they needed $8,000 to do the project, and they raised $9,059, and they received money from 130 backers. And so it's the question, like, how do you know they're legitimate? Well, this is, it's a Lutheran church in St. Paul. They have this video that they explain their project. You can go to their website and check them out. But it's, that's sort of, it's this relationship mediated by the internet. And you can do due diligence, or you can sort of develop. Often, in terms of, I'm thinking about back to Jason's example, folks hear of these because of connections with one another. And so the question of legitimacy becomes a question of relationship. So I asked the pastor, was this successful? And listen to the theology of stewardship and theology of gifts she has here. Sure, she said, we not only funded the CD project, but we get to give this art away for free to the big old world. Artists got to write songs. Our studio people got to do what they are created to do. We get to give it all away, and we got to invite others along in the process. And so they use this sort of new crowdfunding technology to invite people to live into their spiritual gifts. I'm going to skip this one because it's super complicated. Here's an example of one in Rochester that didn't work, but I thought a little bit different. So the campaign was called Help Expand Holy Grounds for All People of Goodwill. It's St. James Coffee. Did any of y'all know that in Rochester? Yeah. Cool. So it's connected to the Catholic Church, Catholic Diocese. And so they were looking for $10,000, and they only raised $4,250 from 30 folks. It wasn't a particularly sophisticated campaign, but it's a local example, so I wanted to show it. And basically, so the mission of the coffee shop has to do with sort of creating a place of hospitality and welcome, and so that a particular type of community can develop. Here's an interesting example of a crowdfunding campaign supporting a mission of a congregation. This is a church in Pittsburgh, that has a nonprofit food pantry type thing, and they came to a difficult budget year, and we're going to have to cut a part-time position that they call a table minister, somebody who supported their nonprofit and just sort of had food with those as part of their food pantry and homeless ministry. And so a friend of mine was part of that campaign, and a friend of mine was in the position that was going to be cut. And she heard from the church that it was going to be cut, and so she asked on Facebook to her friends, any chance you would, if I started a crowdfunding campaign, would you support me? Would you give some money? They said sure. So she talked to the church council, and 2 weeks later she put up a campaign for $10,000, which is how much, she was a part-time position, how much she would pay. And I don't remember how long, but they met the goal of $10,700. She was funded by 94 people. And so it's an example of a congregation sort of expanding the audience to a broader community. So crowdfunding, I just sort of throw it in here because it helps us think about a different kind of vision, a different kind of the way the Spirit may be working. As we're moving completely out of an older paradigm to this new development paradigm where it talks about, it requires new language, it requires new thinking, it requires new tools, and it may be something that the church might live into. Either way, I think it's something that we can appreciate and try to listen and discern how the Spirit might be moving in our world. I'll close with, so I'll say the Center for a Stewardship Leader puts out a weekly newsletter. If you're interested in that, if you can just go to our website, luthersem.edu/stewardship. And I'll close with this, sort of sending a stewardship definition call, and then I'll take a few questions. This is Douglas John Hall again. Stewardship is not, therefore, he says, the gaining of influence, power, property, but rather the care and nurture of life, the healing of one who fell amongst thieves, the feeding of the hungry, and the freeing of the oppressed, the befriending of the friendless, the equitable distribution of earth's bounty, the passion for justice and peace, and dialogue with all who hunger and thirst for authenticity. Thanks so much. Let's have some conversation. Great. I'll come up. Well, he's got the microphone, then we'll come back. Okay.
I have the mic.
There you are. You win.
It would be one of my friends who's spent a lot of his life involved in development and stewardship and the like, talks about the gift of generosity, that at the heart of stewardship is generosity. And if any of you saw this, perhaps it was about 12, 13 years ago, Bill Moyers interviewed Bill Gates on stewardship. And it was the best stewardship sermon I ever heard in my whole life from anybody. And basically Bill Gates said, none of this is mine. It's just entrusted to me. And so my responsibility is to share what I have. The foundation had already been set up. And that's how the conversation was going. And Bill Gates asked him, where did you learn this? And he said, my father. My dad taught me what stewardship was about. And as you know, his father was selected by his son to be chairman, the CEO of the foundation, because he knew what stewardship was. But if you ever find that, I imagine it's somewhere in someplace. That is a fantastic piece of work, and it's also a fantastic testimony of the gift of generosity and that mindset of stewardship that doesn't necessarily have to come from the church or any religious community.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. I'll check out that Bill Moyers clip. Let's bring the mic up here, and I'll respond with the biblical connection. So Deuteronomy 6 is a passage that's exactly around the same line. So God says, so this is when the people are sort of led out and finally sort of have this new land that they're going to live in. They're freed, and God says, the Lord has brought you out of the land that He swore to your ancestors, yada yada, a land of fine large cities that you did not build, houses filled with sorts of good that you did not fill, hewn cisterns that you did not hew, and it goes on. The Lord your God you shall fear, Him you shall serve, by His name you shall swear. And then gives the Shema, the love your Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. So the focus in the biblical tradition as well is this reminder that we didn't do any of this ourselves. And so we're stewarding and responding to the gifts of God. And that, for folks sort of, and from a secular point of view, to appreciate that too, is really beautiful as well, right? Yeah.
Yes, I would like to emphasize time and talent.
Great.
We are given money, but the Lord has given us our being of time and talent. And I really do think this is what we should be emphasizing more. We would have a congregation that would probably be more together, people who don't have a financial situation to give, but could give of their time and talent. Just think of what we could do. Just think of what we could do to help people. And we wouldn't have this awful thing about, oh, these people, why don't they just get a job? Why don't they just get a job? Always focusing on the dollar. It just offends me.
Great.
It offends me.
Great, thanks for that. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So this is sort of a different topic completely, but so one of the cultural shifts that's related to this congregational struggling is, so we moved to a time in which often both members of a couple work. And so the amount of time we have to give is decreasing. And so congregational struggling, how do we invite people to give of their time in a way that helps community? And studies are finding that the relationships that we develop and those folks who live generously, and generosity measured not just in times of money, but in times of volunteering and spending time with others, even helping neighbors, that leads to happier, healthy lives. And so there's something about us and about our sharing with one another and about our connections with one another, supported by Christian communities, that is just at the heart of who we are as people. So yeah, thanks for that great reminder. That's it, okay.
The lady in the front.
There you go.
I have a couple of questions. One is, how, at the very beginning, you talk about the disposable income was the base for the percentages. How do they define disposable income? Is that only after taxes, or do they consider all mandatory deductions?
Yeah, that's a good question. So here's this is maybe a lazy answer. Because these studies all tend to find around the same thing, so I didn't look into sort of the details. The studies aren't very good because it's very hard to actually accurately get, because it's all self-reporting and incredibly expensive to run. But generally, the sort of finding of around 2% giving is consistent across the board. So that's I'm completely just
no. But my
not
question
getting
is
it right.
my question is 2% of what?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think it's so. And the answer is I don't really know. So it's whatever sort of standard disposable income measure tends to be used in academic studies.
Okay.
So it gets to around tithing. It's the big question of like, is it before or after taxes? Again, I don't think that's not quite the.
That's not quite accurate in the real world.
Right, and yeah, it's not really. For me, it's not the point. Great, we can keep talking.
You're gonna have to keep talking afterward. We gotta wrap up, but Adam, thank you for everything today and for sparking lots of questions and conversation in us. Let me just speak really very briefly to the two columns of various ways in which giving is happening here. We are so aware of the changing dynamics and changing fluidity of how people want to give, and so we continue to try to adapt. We have recently, Vanco, full disclosure, is our company that processes all of our automated gifts, whether you give through Simply Giving or through MyZLC. That's our vendor. We also are rolling out a mobile app that is connected to Vanco, and so when I send out a giving letter or the stewardship letter to new members, I kind of address a number of those things, saying, you know what, here's kind of where we're at. We recognize people come from all kinds of different backgrounds on faith, and this might be the first time you've ever considered giving ever in your life. So consider something, but make sure it feels like the right thing, and then go from there. But we know that people are wanting a variety of ways in which to give. So we're trying as much as we can to roll those out in ways that are manageable for staff as well. So Thank you. Next week, Ann Peterson and I will be talking